And you both kind of alluded to a little bit about what we're going to talk about today and what you've been doing with Breedr. But before we dive into some of that, because I'm sure some of that will come up later in the conversation as well, one of the things we always talk about anytime I'm on the phone with either one of you is kind of that more traditional linear industry model versus this loop or full circle beef model. So, can you touch on why you see a loop system or that full circle system really being the future of the beef industry for producers who want to stay ahead of the bell curve and at the top of their game?
Yeah, yeah. I think look, for me, having grown up in the beef industry, when we are producing our cattle, we would mostly get ours to yearlings, and we would send them off, and we'd never know how did they feed, how did they grade, what happened to those cattle. And so when we then came to make culling decisions and breeding decisions, and looking for bulls, we never got any data, and we never were able to improve fast enough. And I think that sort of linear approach to cattle industry, where we make our decisions, we sell them with no understanding of what happens. People will say it takes 10 years to improve our genetics, and that in an industry that's changing with the pressures we have from a commercial perspective, a profitability perspective, a sustainability perspective, like even just a legacy perspective, we need to move faster, and we want to move faster, and there's opportunity now like there's never been to move faster. And I think that's where we came up with full circle beef, and that really is about that data flow. And from your perspective, Suze, do you know?
Yeah, so I think in the traditional model, if you think about buckets, this is how I always think about it. You have your buckets, and each person is doing their own role within their own bucket. So you have your seed stock producer, who then passes the genetics onto the cow calf. Cow calf goes onto the backgrounder onto the feed yard, and then onto the packer, and then ultimately to the consumer. And the cattle move, but the learnings that you have within your organization, they stay within your organization, and the information about the cattle stays within the organization. So you have very little transparency over what's going through. You have very little understanding of what's coming, and then what is going on in the next stages. So the learning opportunity is sort of being cut off at the knees at each time these cattle move on to the next place. I kind of think of it as like baking a cake, and everybody's doing their little bits of it, but nobody gets to taste the cake, and nobody knows how it rose. But every time you're trying to improve your own thing, but you're not getting that kind of basic feedback about what you're doing. So then what we're trying to do is take those buckets and make them into like a fountain and a circle. So the cattle move, and the information about the cattle moves with it, to help everybody manage those cattle in a way that reflects the differences in the cattle. And then the learnings come back to everybody, so everybody can take the insights about which cattle produce the best beef.
I think it's like on a practical level, what it means is if you're a seed stock producer, you're producing bulls, you sell them to the cow calf, you never get progeny data. Like some of the breed associations would say they've only got a few thousand progeny data on some of these bulls that they're building EPDs for. So, how do we now get them tens and 20 and hundreds of thousands of data on the sire lines that are being developed? Well, you can only do that with feedback loops, and being able to work with the cow calf operation, who can now try and cull his cows, not just on the phenotypes, which we all do, but also can cull his cows on carcass data he's got back on that, on how they fed through the feed yard in terms of individual growth rates of those cattle through the feed yard. So knowing the calf that came from that cow, but then knowing, did that grow in the feed yard? Because little changes at a cow calf operation in terms of genetics, health, vaccinations can have an exponential impact on how they grade or how they performs in the feed yard. And I think that ability to feed that information back to the cow calf and seed stock really lets them build better calves, and at the end of the day get the value they deserve for those cattle, because we already have people that are paying $5 a hundredweight more for cattle, where they know those cattle are going to perform once they hit the feed yard, and so that's real money for a cow calf producer.
I think it's also about this idea of mutual gain. So if one stage in that process is improving, you would benefit from the stage that's improving, not only if it's improving before you, but after you. So, better weaning weights, higher health scores, improved carcass quality, all of these benefits, it's shared progress. And then that success doesn't just lift the feed yard at the end, it lifts everybody across the chain because the feed yard will want to come and buy more cattle from you. Everybody's connected because you are the ones that are helping them produce that really consistent high quality of beef.
I like that idea, what you said, Susie, of mutual gain. Now, and Ian, you touched on some of the advantages that people will see. You gave that great example about how producers can cull better for cows that are actually performing with some of this data. But when you look at some of the producers that you've worked with, whether that's in or the UK or if that's in America, wherever they're at, what is one of the first advantages they see on the ranch level once they adopt this full circle mindset?
Yeah, I think the first thing is you can't change what you can't measure. And so, if you, so much of it's guesswork otherwise. So, to be honest, like if we go really back down to the basics in terms of capturing the data and measuring that data that goes through, firstly, it's usually time. Bits of pen and paper that are in a notebook that get lost or have a propensity to get lost, and not actually understanding how individual animals are performing because people are amazing, they can hold a lot in their head. But when it comes to actually really analyzing and getting feedback on what cattle are doing the best, and the time saving of capturing that data, that's the first step. The next step is, really on a weaning weight and also on a grading performance. So, which genetics are they using? And that genetics can be either cow culling and cow selection for breeding, for your replacements, or it can be just which sires should you go back and buy next year. Quite often you're buying from multiple different seed stock producers, which ones are helping you produce the best cattle. And
that for me has always been the most exciting thing. It's just that sire report because that is something that people who've been collecting information about they've been collecting information about their cattle for a while. You can just plug that information straight in, and within an hour or so, you can give somebody the knowledge that these sires produce calves that grow X% faster than the rest of everything else you've produced. So that we had one producer, and he was saying this is going to be worth like 150 pounds in the UK to him per calf, just that little bit of information.
yeah, and what was interesting is like his commercial bull was actually producing calves with higher weaning weights than the one he'd just bought last year, and just because, and they also, he started measuring through genomics, like which ones, how many they produced. It was also producing 60% of the calves, where the other one was only at 30% of the calves for that lot. So it's like, it's just really interesting. But again, if you didn't know that, you couldn't do anything for it. So, and make those changes. So, and with the feed yards we work for, they are already actively looking at where they source better cattle from. Cattle are really expensive right now. So if you're going to be spending money on cattle, you want to be working with the people who have the best health protocols and are producing cattle that are going to grow once they hit the feed yard, and will grade once they hit the packing plant. So, that is happening. And the higher the prices of cattle get, which is only going to increase more, the more people are going to care about this sort of information to be able to make better decisions. And so I think now's a great time. It means we can earn more for our cattle, but also it's going to help, that shared benefit that Suzy's talking about is going to be huge.
There's also a real story about consistency. One of the things that we talk about a lot is how the bottom 20% of your herd will be eating the profit from the top 20% of your herd. So your bottom performers are really doing you a disservice. And part of the low hanging fruit is just identifying which are the cows that are not serving you, which are the sires that perhaps you wouldn't want to be using again, and just taking those out of your herd.
Yeah.
And then that can lift everything up radically.
Yeah, to give you, I mean, just practically, the cow that produces you a calf every year, most cow-calf operations, like that's my best cow. She gives me a calf every year. Now, what if that calf weans 100 pounds lighter than every other calf that you've got? Is it really still your best cow in the herd? Like you add that up over a 4-year period, there's another extra calf, right? So, those sort of things are really, really important to be able to measure. And I think that basic measurement is not complicated. Being able to do that can have a real impact.
Folks, if you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to listen to the full podcast episode on the Casual Cattle Conversations YouTube channel. Remember to hit subscribe to stay in the loop about all things ranching.